Hi, we're Madeline, Jean, Jessica, and Syed, and we'd like to present a case study on sodium overconsumption.
The Institute of Medicine's current recommendation is that healthy individuals should not consume more than 2,300 milligrams of sodium per day. The average daily sodium intake for Americans aged 2 years and older is more than 3,400 milligrams. There are stricter recommendations for individuals in certain groups. People over the age of 50, diabetics, people with chronic kidney disease or hypertension, and all African Americans should limit intake to 1,500 milligrams per day. In the United States, the majority of sodium consumption, approximately 75% in our diets, comes from processed and prepackaged foods and restaurant meals. A smaller percent, 10 to 12, comes from natural foods, and a similar proportion comes from added salt and table salt. Common canned and frozen foods contain approximately 1,000 milligrams or more of sodium in an 8-ounce serving. Many restaurant menu items that do not have nutritional labels may contain sodium in excess of 4,000 milligrams per serving. According to the CDC, approximately 40% of sodium comes from the following 10 groups of foods: breads and rolls, cold cuts and cured meats, pizza, fresh and processed poultry, soups, sandwiches, cheeses, pasta dishes, meat mixed dishes, and snacks. As an example, tomato soup may contain up to 1,260 milligrams of sodium in 1 cup. It is very important to read food labels. Many people are not aware of what constitutes a serving size, especially when it comes to prepackaged and processed foods, or what the serving size contains as far as the amount of carbohydrates, fats, calories, or, our main concern, sodium. Many foods can have high sodium content without tasting salty, so it's important to check the label before adding any additional salt. Also, foods that are perceived as healthy or that may be low or reduced sodium may actually have high levels of sodium. This figure shows the differences in salt content between home-cooked meals and ready-made meals. Home-cooked meals provide a substantially lower amount of sodium for the same food. This chart shows a range of sodium amounts in different types of food. Serving sizes may vary for some foods. For example, bread slices, which may be lower in sodium, may actually be so because the slices are thinner. Not all foods are high in sodium. However, when combined with other food, sodium adds up quickly. For example, 1 slice of bread contains approximately 80 to 230 milligrams of sodium. Breakfast cereals without the milk contain 150 to 300 milligrams of sodium, and 1 slice of frozen pizza may contain 370 to 730 milligrams of sodium, as shown in the figure.
It's important to understand why the food processing industry uses sodium. Sodium has been described as a multifunctional ingredient, currently used as a preservative, texture enhancer, leavening agent, and an inhibitor or mask of bitter flavors. Additionally, sodium chloride has proven more effective than magnesium chloride or potassium chloride in deterring botulinum toxin in food. Beyond merely enhancing flavor, sodium plays an integral role in food safety, preservation, and palatability. This table presents several sodium-containing compounds commonly used in the food processing industry, along with the foods to which they are typically added. From meat and cheese products to fruits and vegetables and condiments, it's evident that sodium plays an integral role in food preservation with widespread use in the processed food industry. On monitoring the sodium content of processed foods from 1983 to 2004, a net decrease of 5% has been reported in average sodium content per serving. That's a decrease from 592 milligrams to 564 milligrams of sodium per serving. A closer look reveals that from 1983 to 1994, the average sodium content per serving decreased by 15%, but from 1994 to 2004, the average sodium content per serving increased by 6%. Possible explanations for the increase of sodium use in food processing include the function of sodium in extending shelf life and the relatively recent trend of using salt to increase positive food perception such as thickness and texture. A number of public health change initiatives dating back to 1969 from government public health agencies including the FDA, HHS, USDA, and the White House have attempted to increase consumer awareness of sodium and health outcomes toward the end of reducing national sodium consumption. Past and current initiatives have focused on point-of-purchase information regarding the sodium content of foods and encouraging the food industry to voluntarily reduce the sodium content of foods. Available data on consumer awareness and behavior, the food industry, and sodium intake all indicate that none of these measures have proven successful in achieving the end goal. It has been suggested that apart from changes in the food supply and in the taste preference for salt, consumer-based initiatives to reduce sodium intake will be insufficient.
Now that we have been given an overview of sodium guidelines, dietary sources of sodium, and the varied role of sodium as a food additive, we will now present trends across person and time in sodium consumption and some of its implications. Current sodium consumption in the U.S. varies largely by age and gender, and to a lesser degree by race. The trends presented here are based on a recent review of data from the National Health and Nutritional Examination Survey between 2003 and 2008. Here we see that among adults, sodium consumption decreases with age. For children, the reverse is true, presumably due simply to larger food intake as children grow and mature. Here we see that men consume more daily sodium than women by about 40%. This trend also holds true similarly among children. And here we see modest differences among white, black, and Mexican American adults in the U.S. for sodium consumption. White adults consume the most sodium, followed by Mexican Americans, and the lowest consumption is reported among African Americans. Here we present data based on a review by the IOM of NHANES data from between 1971 to 2006. These lines show daily sodium consumption by different age groups in both genders. The first obvious conclusion is that current differences by age and gender that we have just discussed have been persistent for the past several decades. What they also show is that daily total sodium consumption in all groups have remained relatively constant since around 1990, and that the increases in sodium consumption had largely occurred in the decades from 1970 to 1990. One of the obvious explanations for both differences across time, age, and gender in sodium consumption is total food consumption. Recently, a study published in the American Journal of Clinical Nutrition tracked changes in total caloric consumption during approximately this same time span, and this study confirmed what most people would assume, which is that caloric consumption had increased since the 1970s as well. The next slide will therefore discuss trends in per-calorie sodium consumption across the same age, gender, and time variables. This graph shows daily sodium consumption per 1,000 calories. In this graph, the yellow line represents males aged 60 to 74, while the blue line shows males aged 20 to 39. In contrast to the previous graph showing total consumption, the older males now actually consume more sodium on a per-calorie basis than the younger males, and this holds pretty true across time. This reversal is also true among females. For gender differences, there is also a reversal of this trend, especially in the two younger age categories, in which females now consume slightly more sodium per calorie than males. This difference, however, is small, and the main story with regards to gender differences is that gender differences in sodium consumption basically disappear when considered on a per calorie basis. Higher total sodium consumption among men in comparison to women is therefore driven by higher food consumption by men rather than differences in sodium density. For differences across age, the two graphs we present jointly suggest that while decreasing sodium consumption of food with age results in a net drop in sodium consumption, there does appear to be a degree of substitution for more sodium-dense foods. What this graph also shows is that increased caloric consumption across time does not completely explain increases in total sodium consumption. If it did, the lines here would be flat. However, the lines show virtually the same trend across time as does the line showing total sodium consumption. So from this, one can pretty well conclude that increases in total sodium consumption over time are a result of greater sodium density in our diets over time. Here we present some derived estimates of compliance with recommended sodium limits when factoring in the lower recommended limit for certain groups. While African Americans consume less sodium than whites, compliance levels are actually about the same when considering the lower limit of 1500 daily milligrams recommended for African Americans. As expected, compliance was also higher in women than among men, and the very low compliance among 51 to 70-year-olds also reflect to some degree the issue of greater sodium density, as discussed previously. Overall, however, dietary compliance was rather low at 2.3%, and initiatives to help lower sodium consumption levels in the U.S. are warranted for all populations.